Hi there, Dan Sutton coming at you live to speak with one of our collaborators here at Syntholene, my friend and colleague, Robert Rapier. Robert, thanks so much for your time today. And I'd love to start off with a little bit of an introduction for yourself, some of your background, and some of the projects you've worked on through your career.
Okay, sure, Dan. I'm Robert Rapier. I am a chemical engineer. I got a master's degree in chemical engineering from Texas A&M University and then went to work in the petrochemical industry. And I worked in Texas along the Gulf Coast. They sent me to Germany for a couple of years, came back to the US, went to work for ConocoPhillips, worked my way through R&D, refining. Then they sent me to Scotland for a couple of years. And from there, I jumped to the Netherlands for a couple of years. And at that point, I left to go to work for a wealthy German entrepreneur. And he wanted me during this time. I'd started to write about energy, and with a very skeptical view. I started a blog, and it got a lot of traffic, and there was a lot of talk about due diligence. And he saw that, and he said, you could be my guy here to go around the world looking at these energy projects. And so that's what I did for him for 5 years. He'd tell me, I need you in Malaysia tomorrow. And I'd go down there and I met with Shell and looked at their projects and looked at things down there, or Panama or Switzerland. I've traveled all over the world for him looking at these projects. So through my career, I have worked in upstream, downstream, biofuels, R&D. I've done a lot of environmental projects. So and a lot of exposure to ethanol production, advanced biofuel production. So that's, and in fact, that was my research in graduate school. When I was getting my master's degree, we were working on converting biomass, like from a landfill, into fuel. And we were actually using a simulated cow stomach. We had a reactor that was the contents of a cow stomach that we'd break that cellulose down. And so it's always been an interest of mine. And when some of the less credible claims started popping up, I was poking holes in a lot of that. And I kind of got a reputation as a kind of a harsh skeptic. I was on 60 Minutes at one point to counter one guy's claims in biofuels. There's a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley had made lots of claims at Capitol Hill and gotten lots of government money. And they interviewed him on 60 Minutes. And they brought me on the counter, and I said, this guy's going to be bankrupt. This company will be bankrupt a year from now, and it was. And it's just, I've got that skeptical eye toward, show me, prove it. And what's the history here? Who's done it before? What have they done? What are you doing differently? And so forth.
Really fascinating stuff. And that's how we were introduced, was through one of our other mutual friends and colleagues, to say, hey, if you want someone to dive into your existing technical diligence at Syntholene, pick it apart, find the red flags, find places where we need to double down on our research, or find where we're trying to potentially bend physics or the nature of economics. And so I was really, I think, ambitious, but then also a little intimidated to bring you on to say, hey, get through our diligence package and tell us what we've got wrong. And that has resulted in a third-party report that you've been developing for us, that we're looking forward to publishing today. Really excited to get that out and share it with our stakeholders and investors and people that are watching our company grow. And that skepticism was really, I think, what attracted us to you. Is this guy's going to give us the straight goods? There's no incentive here for you to drag a horse that might not be able to actually deliver through the diligence process and into production. And I wanted to know, before we make these investments in our construction project that's now active for a demonstration facility for the way that we want to produce synthetic fuels, where we had it wrong. And so um, that process through biofuels and through alternative fuels generally, when you came to start looking at the Syntholene portfolio, that skepticism was really apparent. What did you think at the outset about alternative fuels generally, and on the prospects of synthetic fuels being able to achieve at least somewhere close to economic competitiveness with fossil fuels?
So generally, when I'm approached about something like this, my skepticism level is very high, because 99 times out of 100, people will talk about, this is a game changer, and 99 times out of 100, it will not be. And so that is my initial approach. My initial approach is, where are the red flags, and let me start to poke holes in this. But you know somebody told me once that I'm a black hat thinker, and I said that's not true. I said because while I'm poking holes, I'm also trying to figure out, can we plug those holes? Is will this work as is, and if not, is there a path forward? And that's what I had to do working for the guy out in Hawaii, because we're not just looking to tear projects down, we're looking for ways to make projects work. And so when I was first approached, I said, okay, I've seen similar things before, and here's why they didn't work. And, I read your technical reports. I read the references they were based on. I engaged with your technical people because I had a lot of questions. I said, okay, I don't see how you're going to do this, and I don't see how you're going to do that. And they came back and said, well, it's like this and it's like that. And I said, okay, first of all, if I don't understand this, and I'm reading through, some of your technical reports, if I do not understand this, you're telling me, you did it this way, you need to make it clearer. That's first thing, because if I don't understand it, a layperson is not going to understand it. I think the all around heat integration, heat management, that was some of my early questions and concerns. Projects like this, they have some sensitivities, and I flagged some of those sensitivities, and I said, these are some of the things that you have to be aware of. But at the end of the day, I said, okay, this is not alchemy. And some of them are just alchemy, and some of them are talking about yields that are not even not even realistic in reality. You can't even get those yields theoretically, and they'll claim really high yields. So once I looked at this, I said, okay, it can be done. However, here are the things that you have to be aware of. And if you can check these boxes, you could potentially make a go of this.
Yeah, really interesting. And that was similar to my findings. I'm obviously one of the least technically credentialed people on our team. I'm really lucky to be flagged with local engineering experts who have done the work in solid oxide electrolyzer cells in particular, and fuel synthesis reactors. And what they made me aware of is this advent, especially of the SOEC, is the first time we can envision high temperature steam electrolysis that can use thermal integration. You don't just have to use electricity to create the reaction that allows you to crack hydrogen from water. And this technology, the SOEC, has only really been commercially and industrially mature over the last 36, 48 months. The larger scale deployments of this are relatively recent. However, it has achieved this industrial workhorse capability. And I think that advent of that tech, meeting the same industrial workload standards that more traditional electrolysis devices have had a reputation for over the last 20 to 30 years, is really the gating step. And to pull back for our audience for just a second, when we look at the synthetic fuel production pathway and the algebra of technoeconomics that enable us to envision cost competition over time with other biofuels and with alternate fuels, and then ultimately with fossil fuels, we have to think about energy costs. That seems to be the critical gating factor. Then we have to think about how efficiently we use the energy. And that's why the SOEC was so significant to me, was that you can use multiple energy sources, both heat and electricity, and create these efficiencies. And so in your view, how important is the solid oxide electrolyzer cell to our story and ultimately to the future of fuel synthesis in a cost competitive and economically rational way?
So that is one of the things I didn't know a lot about going into this. I didn't know a lot about SOEC. So I had to do, a lot of due diligence there, a lot of background reading. Was, high temperature, low temperature, you're going to pay the energy costs one way or the other. And that was one of the assumptions I went in with, is that if you have to raise the temperature of the steam that you're electrolyzing, you're putting the energy in there instead of into the electrolysis. Well, that's not exactly true. It is more efficient to electrolyze at high temperature. And when I added all the energy inputs up, you're actually benefiting. You're benefiting from electrolyzing at a high temperature. And in your case, there are a lot of places that have, abundant heat that is not being utilized. And if you're having to heat something up, there's obviously energy costs. But if you can get that heat for cheap or free, and there are some places around the world, like co-location with a nuclear power plant. Nuclear power plants have a lot of excess heat. They have like excess hot water. And if you can co-locate with something like that, or, geothermal heat, then, you can shift your economics quite a bit. And that was the kind of epiphany to me that, you're benefiting efficiency wise by boosting your temperature, and you're boosting it in a way that is relatively cheap. You're not using natural gas to have to boost your temperature up, because then you're kind of defeating the purpose at that point.
We tend to agree, and the Syntholene story had its origins in the nuclear industry. That really is where the pedigree comes from my technical team and the sort of architect of our vision. And John Kutch and Ken Bryan came up with this concept of being able to use the excess waste heat from small modular nuclear reactors, from existing large scale reactors. Even those temperatures are often sufficient to be able to get the priming level, like at least some of the heat from the SOEC, deployed with what would otherwise be waste. And what really clicked for me is that anytime you're trying to trade electrons for heat, you're actually making a pretty lossy conversion. That's just a
Right.
law of conversion physics, and it's the way we understand the technologies today. Now, ironically, that street goes both ways. If you've got a lot of heat and you're trying to spin a turbine with it, that can also create a bunch of losses. So let's just use the heat directly wherever we can and spare the electrons that are inherently going to be the most expensive part of your energy mix. And so that, I think, was really exciting in the nuclear context. It remains exciting in the nuclear context. We're starting to see more and more people talk about the ability to synthesize fuel with co-located nuclear reactors. I hope that that's a reality for Syntholene and for the rest of the energy market in the next 5 years, 10 years. But the trouble with nuclear reactors is they're very hard to develop. They're generally really expensive, and they often go over cost and over budget. And some of that might be novelty or first of a kind systems. Some of it might be regulatory complexity. But that's what drew us to geothermal. Is it's one of the only other energy sources that has very low emissions, very low intermittency factor. It's sort of base load. The heat's been there for a long time. It's going to be there consistently. The consistency is more a function of how you operate the plants than the heat availability. And then it also allows us to have two energy streams, the spinning of a turbine generating electrons, and then also the waste heat that would otherwise, go out into the atmosphere and be lost. And so geothermal as the Earth's nuclear reactor, organic nuclear power. We joke about that a lot internally on the team. That is available today. It's in widespread use. It seems to be an industry that's growing quickly just for the spinning of turbines and generating of electrons. But I think it's really interesting to dive a little deeper on the potential for industrial heat use coming out of fairly enough specialized, tailored geothermal resources. They have to be hot, they have to be shallow, they sort of have to be unusually hot relative to our historic geothermal access, much of which is sort of in the 70 to 120 degrees Celsius range. We want to get it into that 150, 200, 200 plus, and that's where the real efficiencies start to happen. What do you think about the use of geothermal heat as an industrial energy input generally, outside of fuel synthesis?
So overall, two things kill these projects: the heating costs and the electricity costs, and those are two things that often doom projects, and people not doing a proper energy accounting, and then they end up using more energy than they anticipated. So if you have a niche where you can get cheap heat and you can get cheap or free, even free electricity, if there is such a thing, and I would say that solar power, when it's producing more electricity than the grid can handle, you're producing free electricity that could be potentially diverted. So if you've got a source like that, you've got cheap or free geothermal heat, and you've got cheap geothermal electricity, you can push a lot of projects in the direction of economic viability. And I think that's what you've done here. And one of the things I flagged is electricity costs. I mean, you are sensitive to electricity costs. So that is one of the things that I flagged before. I said, if your electricity costs a lot more than you think it's going to, then you could have a problem. And I don't think it's viable in places that have really high electricity costs. But if you're able to control electricity costs, you get cheap electricity, and there are places that have cheap electricity, then that's what would make this viable. That and the fact that you've got cheap heat.
Really interesting, Robert. Well, as you went through our technical documentation, our assumptions, we know that we're holding electricity prices that we have to go and get long-term offtakes, large-scale offtakes for. We've benchmarked a little bit of a price premium compared to what industrial consumers of electricity are currently paying in our region, in Iceland, where we do have this benefit of shallow and hot geothermal resources. And so hopefully we'll be able to find a landing strip there, but that offtake agreement is not codified yet. So we've got more work to do as we embark on our vision to scale this beyond demonstration facility and into commercial and increasingly industrial scale production. But what were the core findings and ultimately the conclusion of this report that goes out today, in your view and in your words?
So my core finding was this is technically viable. It's a technically viable pathway. I felt like you guys understood where the red flags that I would raise. They, your technical team would say, yeah, we're aware. We know that's something that we have to manage and watch. Another one is, what is the durability of the SOECs? We talked about they're fairly new. A lot of cycling, is that, and these are the things that you're going to find out now. These are the things you're going to test and you're going to find out and you're going to see, okay, well, maybe we need to do this a little bit differently. I mean, that's the whole point of doing a demonstration and doing phases. And that was also my conclusion is I would do this in phases just like you're doing it. Too many people jump from a lab and try to build a plant, and there are just so many killer knockout factors there that would have been identified, potentially fixed if you took a scaling process. You jump up from the lab, and then you jump up from your pilot plant to a demonstration facility and then to commercialization. And so I said, I think you've identified all the pathways. I think this, there's nothing here that is a black box where you go, okay, we haven't solved this problem yet. I remember when George Bush in 2001 or so gave the energy speech where he talked about the hydrogen economy. There were like 5 different things that had to be solved to make hydrogen cheap for transportation, and several of those there was no idea how to get from here to there. And so all these years later, we still don't have mass hydrogen as a transportation fuel. And I don't see that in your project. I don't see anywhere where it's like, okay, we've really got to figure out this black box to get from A to B. We don't know how to get there. I think it's just a matter of testing and proving and figuring out where your weak spots are and shoring those up. But again, back to one of my conclusions was, look, I don't know how cheaply you're going to be able to get electricity there. That is a key, and that's on you guys. If you can get the electricity cheaply enough, then I think you can be competitive, in hydrogen production and ultimately syn fuel production.
Fantastic. Well, we absolutely agree, and we are lucky that there are industrial consumers paying below the rate that we need to get to what we perceive as cost competition with fossil fuel unit economics. And I think I'd like to close with that. And maybe it goes sort of without saying, but what is your view of the impact that cost competitive synthetic fuels would deliver to our consumption, demand, the future of our society, the way that we run on probably about 100 million barrels a day of fossil fuels today? How significant is this? How important of a mission is it in your view?
Well, I've always viewed our fossil fuel consumption as as a huge risk, not only to the economy, but to the environment. And we're seeing that play out right now in Iran. The situation over there where they've closed down the Strait of Hormuz, we don't know how long it's going to be closed, but they've essentially taken 20% of the world's oil production offline. And that is probably going to have serious ramifications for the economy if they keep it closed. So you'd love to have the ability to produce fuel that's independent of those kind of geopolitical risks and that doesn't produce, net CO2. You can recycle your fuel inputs, and that's important. That's always been the attraction of biofuels. You're growing crops that pull CO2 out of the air, and you're converting it back into fuel, and the CO2 is going back in the air. So you've got a closed loop, although it's never been a truly closed loop. Biofuel production generally relies on a lot of fossil fuels. So the point is, if you can get away from that, if you can get out of that, those fossil fuel inputs and recycle CO2 back into fuel, that's a very significant thing to be able to do. It's a holy grail. It's been tried many times. I think you guys have a shot here, and I'll definitely be cheering for you. I mean, I as much as I poke holes in these projects, I want some of them to succeed. I want to see us move away from our fossil fuel dependence for a lot of reasons, and one of those, we're seeing it play out right now.
Robert, thank you so much for the effort that you've put into this validation report. Thank you so much for your time today, and really looking forward to driving this project ahead through demonstration and onto commercial scale production. And I'm sure we'll be close in touch when we are crossing the bridges of some of those black boxes that we have good evidence that are not physically impossible, but they certainly require a lot of engineering, a lot of design thinking, and tractable problem sets that are not impossible, but very, very difficult.
I'll be watching closely developments.